The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Marcus Thompson adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that week. At 26 years old, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 3 years, but the weight of the bearskin hat still felt foreign on his head during the early morning shifts. The tourists hadn't arrived yet, which meant he had a few precious moments of peace before the daily circus began. Marcus came from a working-class family in Manchester. His father, Robert, had worked in the textile mills for 30 years before they closed down, and his mother, Sarah, cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. When Marcus announced his decision to join the British Army at 18, his parents had mixed feelings. They were proud, certainly, but worried about their son's safety. They never imagined he would one day stand guard at the most famous palace in the world. The path to becoming a Queen's Guard hadn't been easy. Marcus had spent 4 years in the infantry, including 2 tours in Afghanistan, before being selected for the ceremonial duties. The training was rigorous, not just physically but mentally. Guards were expected to remain motionless for hours, regardless of weather conditions, tourist behavior, or personal discomfort. They were living symbols of British tradition and dignity. As the clock tower chimed 8 in the morning, Marcus took his position at the main gate. His rifle was ceremonial but well-maintained, and his boots shone like black mirrors. Every detail of his uniform had been inspected twice before he stepped outside. The other guards nodded silently as they took their positions. Communication between guards on duty was minimal and professional. The first tour bus arrived at 8:30, disgorging a group of elderly German tourists who immediately began taking photographs. Marcus had learned to tune out the constant clicking of cameras and the excited chatter in dozens of languages. He focused on a point in the distance, his face an impassive mask, just as he had been trained. By 10 o'clock, the courtyard was bustling with visitors from around the world. Marcus had seen it all during his time on duty. Families with excited children trying to make him smile, teenagers attempting to get selfies with him, and amateur comedians thinking they were the first to try various antics. He had developed an impressive ability to ignore even the most persistent tourists while remaining alert for any genuine security concerns. Among the crowd that morning was a group that stood out for all the wrong reasons. They had arrived in a convoy of luxury cars with diplomatic plates, and their clothing screamed expensive exclusivity. Designer suits, watches that cost more than Marcus earned in a year, and an air of entitlement that seemed to push other tourists out of their way. The leader of this group was a man in his 50s named Viktor Kozlov. He was a Russian oligarch who had made his fortune in oil and gas during the chaotic years following the Soviet collapse. Kozlov owned properties in London, New York, and Monaco, and had a reputation for throwing money around to get what he wanted. He was accompanied by his much younger wife, Natasha, who wore a fur coat despite the mild October weather, and 2 bodyguards who tried their best to look inconspicuous while wearing obvious earpieces. Kozlov had visited London many times for business, but this was his first tourist trip to Buckingham Palace. He had dismissed it for years as a quaint British tradition, but Natasha had insisted they visit during their anniversary trip. She was fascinated by royal history and had spent hours researching the palace before their visit. As the group approached the main gate where Marcus stood guard, Kozlov was already showing signs of irritation. The crowds annoyed him, the wait to get decent photographs frustrated him, and the formal restrictions on where visitors could and couldn't go reminded him unpleasantly of the bureaucracy he had spent millions to escape in Russia. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to Natasha in Russian, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear even if they couldn't understand the words. "We should have special access. Do they know who I am?" Natasha placed a calming hand on his arm. "Victor, please. We're here to enjoy ourselves. Look at the beautiful architecture, the history. These guards are part of the tradition." But Kozlov was already fixated on Marcus, who stood perfectly still despite the growing crowd around him. The oligarch had always been bothered by people who couldn't be bought or influenced, and the guard's stoic professionalism irritated him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "These toy soldiers," he said, this time in heavily accented English, ensuring the nearby tourists could understand him. "They think they're so important, standing there like statues. In my country, real soldiers fight real wars." A few tourists glanced uncomfortably at Kozlov, then at Marcus, who gave no indication he had heard anything. This only served to increase the Russians' frustration. He was accustomed to immediate reactions to his presence, whether respect, fear, or fawning attention. The guard's indifference was something entirely outside his experience. Marcus, meanwhile, was well aware of the developing situation. His training had taught him to monitor crowd dynamics while maintaining his ceremonial posture. He could sense when someone was becoming agitated or when a situation might escalate. The loud man in the expensive suit was definitely someone to watch, but protocol demanded he remain motionless unless there was a direct threat to security. What Marcus couldn't know was that Kozlov was having one of the worst weeks of his business career. A major deal had fallen through in Moscow, costing him millions. British authorities were investigating some of his London property purchases. His relationship with Natasha was strained because of his increasingly volatile mood swings. He had come to London hoping to relax, but everything seemed to be adding to his frustration. As more tourists gathered around Marcus for photographs, Kozlov found himself pushed to the back of the crowd. This was another new experience for him. In his usual circles, people stepped aside to let him pass. Bodyguards cleared paths for him. No one ever made Viktor Kozlov wait or treated him like an ordinary person. "Excuse me," he said loudly, pushing through the crowd. "I need to get closer for a photograph." The other tourists, mostly polite families and elderly couples, tried to accommodate him, but the space was limited. Everyone wanted their moment with the famous Queen's Guard. A Japanese family was taking turns posing near Marcus, their elderly grandmother particularly delighted by the experience. "Move," Kozlov barked, his patience finally snapping. "Don't you know who I am? I'm an important businessman. These people can wait." The Japanese family looked confused and frightened by his sudden aggression. Other tourists began murmuring disapprovingly, but no one wanted to confront the obviously agitated man directly. Natasha hurried over, embarrassed by her husband's behavior. "Victor, please," she whispered urgently in Russian. "People are staring. You're making a scene." But Kozlov was beyond caring about public opinion. He pushed past an elderly British couple, causing the woman to stumble slightly. Her husband reached out to steady her, looking shocked at the rude behavior. "Steady on, mate," the British man said mildly. "No need to push. There's plenty of room for everyone." Kozlov whirled around, his face red with anger. "Don't tell me what to do, old man. I pay more in taxes than you'll see in a lifetime." The crowd was now watching the confrontation with a mixture of fascination and concern. Some people had their phones out, though whether to call for help or record the incident wasn't clear. Marcus remained motionless, but his awareness was heightened. This was exactly the kind of situation that could escalate quickly. Security cameras were recording everything, and Marcus knew that somewhere in the palace security office, people were watching and ready to intervene if necessary. But the protocol was clear. Guards were not to break character unless there was an immediate physical threat to themselves or others. Kozlov finally reached the front of the crowd and stood directly in front of Marcus. For a moment, the two men were face to face, though Marcus continued to stare straight ahead as if the Russian didn't exist. This close, Kozlov could see the young guard's face clearly. There was something about Marcus's quiet dignity and unwavering composure that reminded the oligarch uncomfortably of his own father. Viktor Kozlov Sr. had been a factory worker in Volgograd, a man who took pride in honest work and had little patience for his son's business methods. The old man had died 5 years earlier, but not before making it clear what he thought of the fortune Viktor had built through corruption and exploitation. Looking at the guard's steady gaze and firm jawline, Kozlov was suddenly reminded of his father's disapproval. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Kozlov demanded, his voice rising. "I'm standing right here. Have some respect." Marcus continued to stare ahead, his expression unchanged. His breathing remained steady, his posture perfect. To the watching crowd, he looked completely unaffected by the confrontation, but internally he was running through his training. The man was clearly agitated, but hadn't made any threatening moves. The situation was uncomfortable, but not dangerous enough to warrant breaking protocol. What the crowd couldn't see was that Marcus was also fighting his own internal battle. 3 years of ceremonial duty had taught him patience, but they hadn't erased his human instincts entirely. He could feel his jaw tensing slightly and had to consciously relax it. The man's behavior was not just rude but genuinely offensive, and part of Marcus wanted to respond. But he thought about his father, working those long shifts in the mill without complaint. He thought about his mother, cleaning offices through the night to help pay the bills. They had taught him that dignity wasn't about fighting back against every slight, but about maintaining your principles regardless of how others behaved. Kozlov was growing more frustrated by the second. He had spent his adult life in environments where money and power could solve any problem, where a raised voice and Implied threats were usually enough to get what he wanted. The guard's continued silence felt like a personal insult. "You think you're better than me?" Kozlov continued, his accent becoming thicker as his anger grew. "Standing there in your costume like some kind of hero? You're nothing but a tourist attraction, a performing monkey for the entertainment of peasants." Natasha was now pulling at her husband's sleeve, desperately trying to get him to walk away. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle, and several people were now openly filming with their phones. She could see this was going to be embarrassing at best, and possibly much worse. "Victor, please," she pleaded. "Let's go see the gardens. The roses are supposed to be beautiful this time of year." But Kozlov shook her off, completely focused on the guard who continued to ignore him. In his mind, this had become a test of wills, and Viktor Kozlov had never backed down from a challenge in his life. Unfortunately, he had also never encountered someone who literally could not respond to his provocations. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Kozlov becoming increasingly agitated and Marcus remaining perfectly still. Other tourists were beginning to feel uncomfortable with the tension, and some were moving away from the area. A few British visitors looked like they wanted to intervene, but weren't sure how to handle the situation. Finally, Kozlov's frustration reached a breaking point. In a moment of pure rage and humiliation, he did something that would change both men's lives forever. He gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly at Marcus, the glob of spit landing on the guard's pristine red tunic just below his left shoulder. The crowd gasped collectively, and, for a moment, complete silence fell over the courtyard. Even the ambient sounds of London traffic seemed to fade away. Natasha covered her mouth in horror, finally, understanding that her husband had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Marcus felt the warm wetness soak through his uniform, but his expression didn't change. His training held, even in this moment of ultimate disrespect. But, inside, something fundamental shifted. This wasn't just about protocol anymore, or even personal dignity. This was about everything his uniform represented, everything his service meant to his country and his family. The crowd waited to see what would happen next, phones recording every second. Security cameras captured every angle. In the palace security office, alarms were beginning to sound, and personnel were mobilizing. But, for now, in this moment suspended between action and reaction, the world seemed to hold its breath. What happened next would depend entirely on how a young man from Manchester, who had learned about honor from his working-class parents and duty from his military service, chose to respond to the ultimate test of his character. The silence that followed Kozlov's disgusting act seemed to stretch forever, though it lasted only seconds. Marcus could feel the spit slowly soaking through his ceremonial tunic, a warm, humiliating wetness that served as a stark reminder of what had just happened. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to react, to abandon his post, and confront the man who had just committed this ultimate act of disrespect. But Marcus Thompson was not an ordinary young man. 3 years of guard duty had taught him something that money could never buy: the power of self-control. More importantly, his upbringing in Manchester had instilled in him values that ran deeper than momentary anger. His father had always said that a man's true character is revealed not when he's comfortable, but when he's tested beyond his limits. The crowd around them was growing larger by the minute. Word of the incident had spread quickly among the tourists, and people were hurrying over to see what was happening. Phones were held high, recording every moment. Social media notifications were already beginning to ping as early videos and photos started appearing online. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, centering himself the way his military training had taught him. He thought about his grandmother, who had lived through the London Blitz and never complained about the hardships she had endured. She had always told him that dignity was something no one could take away from you unless you gave it to them willingly. Instead of breaking character or responding with anger, Marcus did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He slowly, deliberately, turned his head to look directly at Kozlov. This simple movement, which broke from the rigid protocol guards were expected to follow, sent a ripple of anticipation through the watching crowd. When Marcus's eyes met Kozlov's, the Russian oligarch saw something he hadn't expected. There was no rage in the young guard's gaze, no hatred or desire for revenge. Instead, there was a calm strength that seemed to look right through Kozlov's expensive clothes and aggressive posture to see the broken, insecure man underneath. "Sir," Marcus said in a clear, steady voice that carried across the courtyard, "I can see that you're upset about something. I don't know what's troubling you, but I want you to know that I forgive you for what you just did." The crowd gasped again, this time in amazement rather than horror. This was not what anyone had expected to happen. Kozlov himself looked stunned, as if he had been slapped instead of offered forgiveness. Marcus continued, his voice remaining calm and respectful despite the obvious provocation he had just endured. I'm here to serve my country and to represent the best traditions of the British Army. Part of that service means treating all visitors with dignity and respect, even when they don't show the same courtesy in return. Natasha Kozlov felt tears welling up in her eyes. In the 3 years since she had married Victor, she had watched him use his wealth and power to bulldoze through any obstacle, to intimidate and humiliate anyone who stood in his way. She had never seen anyone respond to his aggression with such grace and strength. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Many people had their phones out, but they had stopped focusing on getting the perfect video and were instead genuinely listening to what the young guard was saying. I don't know what's happening in your life right now, Marcus continued, addressing Kozlov directly, but I can tell that you're angry about something that has nothing to do with me. Sometimes when people are hurting inside, they lash out at others. I understand that, and I don't take it personally. Kozlov's face was cycling through a range of emotions. The anger was still there, but it was being replaced by confusion and something that might have been shame. He had expected a confrontation, a shouting match that would confirm his belief that everyone could be reduced to his level if pushed hard enough. Instead, he was being treated with kindness by the very person he had just humiliated. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, which he offered to Kozlov. You might want to wipe your mouth, sir. Sometimes when we're very upset, we don't realize how we look to others. This simple gesture broke something inside Viktor Kozlov. For the first time in years, he was face to face with someone who was genuinely better than him, not in terms of wealth or power, but in character and integrity. The handkerchief hung between them like a bridge between two completely different worlds. Behind Marcus, other guards were beginning to stir. Palace security was mobilizing, and senior officers were making their way toward the scene. But Marcus raised his free hand slightly, a subtle signal that he had the situation under control. His colleagues trusted his judgment and held their positions. I can't accept that, Kozlov mumbled, looking down at his expensive Italian shoes. For the first time since the confrontation began, his voice was quiet, uncertain. It's not about what you can or can't accept, Marcus replied gently. It's about choosing to be better than our worst moments. We all have them, sir. The question is what we do next. The crowd was now witnessing something extraordinary. What had begun as an ugly confrontation was transforming into something deeper, a genuine moment of human connection in the most unlikely circumstances. People who had come to London as tourists were seeing something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. An elderly woman in the crowd, Mrs. Eleanor Richardson, had been visiting the palace with her granddaughter. She had lived through World War II as a child and remembered the stories her parents told about the kindness of strangers during the darkest times. She stepped forward slightly, her voice carrying the authority of her years. Young man, she said, addressing Marcus, your parents raised you right. This is what real strength looks like. Her granddaughter, Sophie, was 17 and had been filming the entire incident on her phone. But now she lowered the device, realizing she was witnessing something more important than social media content. She would later post about the experience, but her words would focus on the lesson about dignity and forgiveness rather than the drama of the confrontation. Marcus turned his attention briefly to Mrs. Richardson and nodded respectfully. Thank you, ma'am. My parents did their best to teach me right from wrong. They would have wanted me to handle this situation with grace. Kozlov was struggling with emotions he hadn't felt in decades. The last time someone had shown him unconditional kindness had been during his childhood, before he learned that money and power were the only things that mattered in the world. His own father had tried to teach him different values, but Victor had rejected those lessons as naive and impractical. Now, standing in front of this young soldier who had every right to hate him but chose forgiveness instead, Kozlov was remembering the man his father had wanted him to become. The memory was painful, but it was also oddly liberating. For just a moment, he could imagine a different version of himself, one that didn't need to dominate and humiliate others to feel worthy. Why? Kozlov asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you being kind to me after what I did? Marcus considered the question seriously before answering. Because someone taught me that every person has value, regardless of how they behave in any given moment. You're obviously successful and intelligent, which means you're capable of being better than what you showed here today. I believe in giving people the chance to prove that." Natasha had moved closer during this exchange, and she could see the internal struggle playing out on her husband's face. She had fallen in love with Victor because underneath his hard exterior, she had glimpsed moments of the good man he could be. Those moments had become rarer over the years as his success had increased his arrogance, but she had never stopped hoping they would return. "Victor," she said softly in Russian, "this is your chance to remember who you used to be before you became so angry at the world." The palace security team was now positioned around the perimeter of the crowd, ready to intervene if the situation escalated. But their supervisor, Captain James Morrison, was watching Marcus handle the confrontation with professional admiration. Morrison had served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan before taking his current position, and he recognized leadership when he saw it. Morrison made a decision that would later be discussed in security briefings for months to come. Instead of ordering an immediate intervention, he allowed Marcus to continue managing the situation. The young guard was demonstrating exactly the kind of judgment and character that made the Queen's Guard more than just a ceremonial unit. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown to include several dozen people, but the atmosphere was no longer tense or threatening. People were witnessing something beautiful and rare, and they seemed to understand instinctively that this was not a moment for loud voices or aggressive behavior. Even the children in the crowd had stopped their chatter and were watching quietly. Marcus could see that Kozlov was struggling with something internal, and he decided to share something personal to help bridge the gap between them. "Sir, I want to tell you about my father. He worked in a textile mill for 30 years before it closed down. When that happened, he was angry and bitter for a while. He felt like the world had forgotten about people like him." Kozlov looked up, something in Marcus's tone capturing his attention. "But my father made a choice," Marcus continued. "He could have stayed angry and taken that anger out on everyone around him, or he could have found a way to channel it into something positive. He chose to become a volunteer at a local community center, helping other people who had lost their jobs learn new skills." The story was hitting closer to home than Marcus realized. Kozlov's own father had worked in a factory, and Victor remembered the dignity with which the older man had faced every challenge, even when his son's business success had embarrassed him. "The point is," Marcus said, "my father taught me that how we handle our worst moments defines who we really are. Today can be a bad moment that you learn from, or it can be the beginning of something worse. The choice is entirely yours." For the first time since the confrontation began, Kozlov looked directly into Marcus's eyes and held the gaze. What he saw there was not judgment or superiority, but genuine hope that he would choose to be better. It was a look that reminded him powerfully of his father's face during their last conversation before the old man died. "I'm sorry," Kozlov said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm sorry for what I did. You didn't deserve that. No one deserves that." The crowd released a collective breath they didn't realize they had been holding. Apologies from men like Viktor Kozlov were rare enough to be newsworthy in themselves, but this felt different. This felt genuine. Marcus smiled for the first time since the incident began, and his entire face transformed. The stern, professional mask of the ceremonial guard was replaced by the warm expression of a young man who genuinely cared about others. "Apology accepted, sir," he said simply. "And I appreciate you saying that." But Kozlov wasn't finished. Something had broken open inside him, and words were pouring out that he didn't even know he had been holding back. "You remind me of my father," he said, his Russian accent thick with emotion. "He was a good man, better than I ever learned to be. He would have been ashamed of what I did here today." Natasha was now openly crying, but they were tears of relief and hope. She had been watching her husband become harder and more cynical with each passing year, and she had begun to wonder if the man she had fallen in love with was gone forever. This moment of vulnerability and honesty was the first sign she had seen in years that he might still be reachable. The story was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted in that London courtyard. What had begun as an ugly display of entitlement and aggression had become a masterclass in grace under pressure. And everyone present, from the tourists with their cameras to the security personnel monitoring from a distance, understood that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Captain Morrison decided it was time to step forward. The situation had been defused beautifully by Marcus, but protocol demanded that he assess the situation officially and determine what actions needed to be taken. As he approached, the crowd parted respectfully, recognizing his authority from his bearing and uniform. "Guard Thompson," Morrison said formally, though his tone carried warmth and approval. "Please report the status of the situation." Marcus straightened to attention, though he kept his expression open and calm. "Sir, there was a brief incident involving a distressed visitor. The situation has been resolved amicably, and no further action is required from security." Morrison glanced at Kozlov, who was still visibly shaken by the emotional exchange. The captain had been watching the entire interaction through the security monitors and had seen both the initial provocation and Marcus's remarkable response. He made a quick decision that showed why he had risen to his current position. "Mr. Kozlov," Morrison said, addressing the Russian directly, "I understand there was a misunderstanding. These situations can be stressful for everyone involved. Would you like to speak privately about what happened here today?" The offer was both diplomatic and practical. It gave Kozlov a face-saving way to discuss the incident while also allowing security to get his version of events. More importantly, it showed that the palace staff were treating him as a person rather than just a problem to be solved. Kozlov looked confused by the kindness he was being shown. In his experience, authority figures were either people to be bought or obstacles to be overcome. The captain's respectful but firm approach was something entirely new to him. Yes," Kozlov managed. "I would like that. But first, I need to say something to everyone here." He turned to face the crowd, which had grown to include nearly 100 people. His hands were shaking slightly, and his voice was unsteady, but his words carried the weight of genuine emotion. "My name is Viktor Kozlov," he began. "I am a businessman from Russia, and I have more money than most people will ever see in their lifetimes. But today, I learned that all the money in the world cannot buy you the kind of character this young soldier just showed me." The crowd was listening intently, many still recording with their phones. What had started as a scandal was becoming something much more profound. "I treated this man with disrespect and cruelty," Kozlov continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "He had every right to be angry with me, to have me arrested, to respond with the same hatred I showed him. Instead, he chose kindness. He chose forgiveness. He chose to see the better person I could be, even when I couldn't see it myself." Natasha moved to stand beside her husband, taking his arm in a gesture of support. She had never been more proud of him than she was in this moment, watching him take responsibility for his actions in front of complete strangers. "I want everyone here to know," Kozlov said, looking directly at Marcus, "that this young man is what a real hero looks like. Not because he carries a gun or wears a uniform, but because he has the strength to choose love over hate, even when it would be easier to choose hate." The applause that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. People were clapping not just for Marcus, but for the transformation they had witnessed in Kozlov himself. Several tourists were wiping away tears, moved by the genuine emotion of the moment. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the response, but also humbled. He had simply done what felt right in the moment, drawing on the values his parents had instilled in him. He hadn't expected it to have such a profound impact on so many people. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said to Kozlov. "It takes real courage to admit when we've made a mistake, especially in front of so many people. I respect you for that." Captain Morrison was impressed by how both men were handling the situation. This could have become a major international incident, with diplomatic repercussions and negative publicity for the palace. Instead, it was turning into a positive story about reconciliation and human decency. "If I may," Morrison said, "I'd like to suggest that we move this conversation to a more private setting. Mr. Kozlov, Guard Thompson, would you both be willing to join me in the security office for a few minutes? We can discuss how to handle the administrative aspects of what happened here today." Both men agreed, and Morrison began dispersing the crowd with the help of other security personnel. The tourists were reluctant to leave, sensing that they had witnessed something special, but they cooperated with the polite but firm requests to move along. As they walked toward the security office, Natasha fell into step beside Marcus. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you had reacted differently. You saved my husband from himself today." Marcus looked at the elegant woman walking beside him and saw genuine gratitude in her eyes. "Mrs. Kozlov, everyone deserves a second chance to do the right thing. Your husband just needed someone to believe he was capable of it." "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you know that kindness would work when everything else just makes him angrier?" Marcus thought about the question as they continued walking. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I just knew that responding with anger would have made everything worse. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith that people are better than their worst moments." Inside the security office, Captain Morrison offered coffee and chairs to everyone. The atmosphere was formal but not tense, more like a business meeting than an interrogation. Morrison had decided to treat this as a learning opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter. Mr. Kozlov, Morrison began, I want you to know that what happened today will be documented in our incident reports, but Guard Thompson has requested that no criminal charges be filed. That's his right as the victim of the assault. Kozlov looked surprised. He could have me arrested? Assault charges, yes, Morrison confirmed. What you did was technically a crime under British law. Guard Thompson could pursue legal action if he chose to do so. But I won't, Marcus said firmly. What would be the point? You've apologized, you've shown that you understand what you did was wrong. Punishing you further wouldn't serve any purpose except revenge, and that's not what justice should be about. Morrison nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of judgment he hoped to see from his guards. They were trained to use force when necessary, but also to recognize when mercy was the better choice. However, Morrison continued, I do need to ask what led to this incident. Understanding the context will help us prevent similar situations in the future. Kozlov was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and introspective in a way that surprised even Natasha. I have been angry for a very long time, he said slowly. Angry at Russia for the corruption that forced me to leave. Angry at the West for looking down on people like me. Angry at myself for the things I had to do to become successful. I carry that anger everywhere I go, and sometimes it explodes at innocent people who don't deserve it. He looked at Marcus with something approaching shame. This young man did nothing wrong. He was simply doing his job with dignity and pride, and that reminded me of everything I used to believe in before I became cynical and bitter. Morrison was taking notes, but his expression showed understanding rather than judgment. Stress and anger can build up over time if we don't find healthy ways to deal with them. It sounds like today was a breaking point for you. It was, Kozlov agreed. But maybe it was also a turning point. I don't want to be the kind of man who spits on soldiers anymore. I want to be the kind of man my father raised me to be. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. Mr. Kozlov, can I ask you something personal? Of course. What did your father do for work? Kozlov smiled sadly. He was a foreman in a steel factory in Volgograd. He worked with his hands his whole life. Never made much money, but he was respected by everyone who knew him. He was honest, fair, kind to his workers. Everything I forgot how to be. He sounds like a good man, Marcus said. My father worked in a textile mill. Blue-collar workers, people who understood that dignity comes from how you treat others, not from how much money you have. The conversation continued for another hour, covering not just the incident itself, but the broader issues it had revealed. Morrison was skilled at drawing people out, and both Kozlov and Marcus found themselves sharing things they hadn't expected to discuss. Kozlov talked about the guilt he felt over some of his business practices, the way success had isolated him from genuine human connections, and his fear that it was too late to change. Marcus shared his own struggles with maintaining his values while serving in an environment where he was constantly tested by difficult people and situations. By the end of the conversation, something resembling a friendship had formed between the two men. They came from completely different worlds, but they had found common ground in their shared respect for their fathers and their desire to live up to the values they had been taught as children. I have a proposition, Kozlov said as the meeting was winding down. I know this might sound strange, but I would like to make a donation to a charity of your choice, Guard Thompson. Not as payment for your kindness, but as a way of honoring what you taught me today. Marcus was immediately uncomfortable with the idea. Sir, that's very generous, but I can't accept anything for just doing my job. It wouldn't be for you personally, Kozlov clarified. It would be for a cause you believe in. A way of turning something negative into something positive. Morrison interjected. That would actually be appropriate, Guard Thompson. Charitable donations in response to public incidents are not uncommon, and it would send a positive message about how conflicts can be resolved constructively. After some discussion, Marcus agreed to suggest a few veterans' charities that helped former soldiers transition to civilian life. Kozlov immediately committed to making substantial donations to all of them, expressing particular interest in programs that helped veterans start their own businesses. I understand what it's like to feel displaced, he said, to leave one life behind and struggle to build a new one. If I can help other people make that transition more successfully than I did, maybe that's a way to balance the scales a little bit. As they prepared to leave the security office, Natasha approached Marcus one more time. You've given me my husband back, she said quietly. I haven't seen him be vulnerable and honest like this in years. I don't know how to thank you for that. Marcus was embarrassed by the praise, but he could see that she was sincere. Mrs. Kozlov, your husband is a good man who lost his way for a while. He just needed someone to remind him of who he really is underneath all the anger and success. Will you stay in touch? She asked. I think Victor could benefit from having a friend like you, someone who sees the best in people. Marcus looked at Kozlov, who was standing near the door looking hopeful but uncertain. It was an unusual request, but something about the man's obvious desire to change made Marcus want to help if he could. I'd be honored to call you both friends, he said. Change isn't easy, and everyone needs support when they're trying to become a better version of themselves. As they walked back through the palace corridors toward the main courtyard, the three of them attracted curious stares from staff members who had heard about the incident. Word had spread quickly through the palace network, and everyone was eager to see how the situation had been resolved. The crowds outside had largely dispersed, but there were still tourists taking photographs and enjoying their visits. Life at Buckingham Palace had returned to normal, but something fundamental had changed for the people involved in the morning's confrontation. 3 weeks after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus Thompson was settling into his evening routine in his small flat in South London when his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and was surprised to see Victor Kozlov's name. The two men had exchanged contact information before parting that day, but Marcus hadn't expected to hear from the Russian businessman so soon. Hello, Mr. Kozlov, Marcus answered, setting down the book he had been reading. Marcus, please, call me Victor, came the familiar accented voice, though it sounded different somehow. Lighter, less burdened. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to share some news with you. Not at all, Victor. I was just reading. What's on your mind? I've done something that I think you'll appreciate, Victor said, and Marcus could hear genuine excitement in his voice. Remember how we talked about finding positive ways to channel anger and frustration? Well, I've made a decision that I think my father would have been proud of. Marcus settled back in his chair, intrigued. I'm listening. I've established a foundation, Victor continued. The Victor Kozlov Senior Foundation, named after my father. It's going to focus on helping working-class people start their own businesses, particularly people who have been displaced by economic changes or industrial closures. The announcement took Marcus by surprise. He had hoped that their conversation had made an impact on Victor, but he hadn't expected such a dramatic and concrete response. That's incredible, Victor. Tell me more about it. Well, Victor said, and Marcus could picture him leaning forward with enthusiasm. I've been thinking about what you said about your father, how he chose to help other people when his mill closed down. I realized that I've spent years being angry about my own displacement from Russia, but I never thought about using my resources to help other people who are going through similar experiences. Victor went on to explain that he had committed £50 million to the foundation as initial funding, with plans to add more as the programs developed. The foundation would provide low-interest loans, business training, and mentorship to people starting their own enterprises. But here's the part I'm most excited about, Victor continued. I want to base the foundation's headquarters in Manchester, in the area where your father worked. I've been researching the economic history of the region, and I think it would be the perfect place to start this work. Marcus felt a surge of emotion at the mention of his hometown. Victor, that's amazing. Manchester has struggled since so many of the mills and factories closed. A program like this could make a real difference in people's lives. I hope so, Victor said. But I have a favor to ask. I know this might be presumptuous, but I was wondering if you'd consider joining the foundation's board of directors. I need people who understand what it's like to come from working-class families, people who won't let me lose sight of why this work matters. The request caught Marcus completely off guard. I'm honored that you'd think of me, Victor, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that. I'm a soldier, not a businessman. That's exactly why I need you, Victor insisted. I have plenty of advisors who understand money and business strategy. What I need is someone who understands people, someone who can help me remember that behind every application and every loan request is a real person with real hopes and dreams. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about the offer. It would mean taking on responsibilities he had never imagined, but it also represented an opportunity to help people in the kind of community where he had grown up. Can I think about it? Marcus asked finally. Of course, Victor said. Take all the time you need. But, Marcus, I want you to know that what happened between us that day at the palace, it changed my life. I haven't been truly happy in years, but Working on this foundation has given me a sense of purpose I didn't know I was missing. After they hung up, Marcus sat in his flat thinking about the conversation. 3 weeks ago, he had been focused solely on his duties as a Queen's Guard, content with his role, but not particularly thinking about his long-term future. Now he was being offered a chance to help create something that could impact thousands of lives. He decided to call his parents in Manchester to discuss Victor's offer. His father answered the phone, and Marcus could hear the television in the background showing the evening news. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," Marcus said after the usual pleasantries. "What's on your mind, son?" Marcus explained the entire situation, from the incident at the palace to Victor's phone call that evening. His father listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just taking in the remarkable story. "So this Russian fellow wants you to help him give money to people like us?" his father said when Marcus finished. "Essentially, yes. He wants to help working-class people start their own businesses, and he's asked me to help make sure the foundation stays true to that mission." Robert Thompson was quiet for a long moment. "You know, Marcus, when the mill closed down, I thought about starting my own business. I had some ideas about small manufacturing, things that could be done locally. But I could never get the financing, and I didn't know how to navigate all the business regulations and paperwork. What happened to those ideas?" "Oh, I still have the notebooks where I wrote everything down," his father said with a laugh. "Your mother keeps threatening to throw them away, but I can't bring myself to get rid of them. They represent a dream, you know?" Marcus felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly what Victor was talking about, the dreams and aspirations that got buried under economic necessity, but never really died. "Dad, what if those dreams didn't have to stay buried? What if there was a way to help people like you turn those ideas into reality?" "That would be something special, son. Really special." After talking with both his parents, Marcus found himself increasingly drawn to Victor's offer. His mother had pointed out that military service had always been about serving something larger than himself, and this foundation could be another way to serve people who needed help. The next morning, Marcus was surprised to receive a call from Captain Morrison requesting a meeting. He reported to the security office, wondering if there had been some development related to the incident with Victor. "Guard Thompson," Morrison began when Marcus arrived, "I've received some interesting correspondence that I wanted to discuss with you." Morrison handed him a formal letter on expensive letterhead. Marcus recognized it immediately as being from Victor's law firm. "Mr. Kozlov has written to request permission for you to serve on the board of his foundation while maintaining your duties as a Queen's Guard," Morrison explained. Normally, this kind of outside commitment would be problematic, but the nature of the work and the way it originated make this a special case. Marcus read through the letter, which outlined the foundation's mission and explained that Marcus's role would involve attending monthly board meetings and participating in the review of grant applications. The time commitment was modest enough to be compatible with his guard duties. "What's the palace's position on this?" Marcus asked. Morrison smiled. "Actually, we're quite supportive of the idea. The incident 3 weeks ago could have been a public relations disaster, but instead it's turning into a story about reconciliation and positive change. Having you involved with the foundation will reinforce that narrative. So I have permission to accept?" "You have permission, and you have our encouragement," Morrison confirmed. "The palace believes that this kind of community service reflects well on the Guard and demonstrates our commitment to the broader public good." Marcus felt a sense of pieces falling into place. The opportunity to help Victor channel his resources toward helping working-class communities aligned perfectly with his own values and background. It was also a chance to honor his father's unfulfilled dreams by helping other people pursue their own. That afternoon, Marcus called Victor to accept the position on the foundation's board. Victor was thrilled and immediately began talking about plans for the foundation's launch and the kinds of programs they would establish. "I've been researching Manchester," Victor said, "and I found a perfect building for our headquarters. It's actually an old textile mill that's been converted to office space. I thought it would be symbolically appropriate." "Which mill?" Marcus asked, suddenly curious. Victor mentioned an address that made Marcus catch his breath. "Victor, that's the mill where my father worked. The one that closed down 15 years ago." The coincidence seemed too perfect to be random, and both men were quiet for a moment, struck by the symmetry of the situation. "Marcus," Victor said finally, "I'm starting to think that what happened between us at the palace was meant to happen. Not the ugly part, but everything that came after. Maybe sometimes bad moments are just the beginning of something much better." Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself increasingly excited about the Foundation's work. He attended planning meetings via video call, reviewed draft documents, and even traveled to Manchester on a weekend to tour the proposed headquarters building. Walking through the renovated mill where his father had once worked was an emotional experience. The machinery was long gone, replaced by modern office space and conference rooms, but Marcus could imagine the generations of workers who had earned their living in these same rooms. Natasha Kozlov had also become involved with the Foundation, focusing on programs to help the spouses and children of displaced workers. She had a natural empathy for families struggling with economic transitions, and her ideas for support programs were both practical and compassionate. "You know," she told Marcus during one of their planning meetings, "Victor is becoming the man I always believed he could be. He's thrown himself into this work with more passion than I've seen from him in years." The Foundation's official launch was scheduled for 2 months after the Palace incident, with the first grants to be awarded shortly thereafter. Local newspapers in Manchester had picked up the story, and there was considerable excitement in the community about the potential opportunities. One evening, Marcus received a call from a man named David Walsh, whose story would become the Foundation's first major success. David had lost his job when a local factory closed, and he had been struggling to support his family while trying to start a small construction business. "I heard about your foundation," David said, "and I wanted to know if it might be able to help someone like me. I've got experience, I've got customers lined up, but I can't get the bank to give me a loan because I don't have enough collateral." Marcus spent an hour on the phone with David, learning about his background, his business plan, and his dreams for the future. By the end of the conversation, he was convinced that David represented exactly the kind of person the Foundation was designed to help. "David," Marcus said, "I think you're going to be very happy with what the Victor Kozlov Senior Foundation can do for you." The transformation of that original moment of ugliness and hatred into something beautiful and constructive was nearly complete. But the most powerful changes were still to come, as the Foundation began to touch the lives of real people in ways that none of them had imagined possible. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus Thompson stood in the main conference room of the Victor Kozlov Senior Foundation headquarters in Manchester, looking out at an audience of 50 local residents who had gathered for the Foundation's first major community meeting. The renovated textile mill had been transformed into a bright, modern space that somehow still honored its industrial heritage. Victor Kozlov sat at the head table, but he looked nothing like the angry, entitled man who had spat on Marcus that October morning. He was leaner, his eyes were brighter, and when he smiled, it reached his eyes in a way that hadn't happened in years. Natasha sat beside him, radiant with pride at the changes she had witnessed in her husband. "Friends," Victor began, addressing the crowd in English that had improved dramatically over the past months. "6 months ago, I was a very different man than I am today. I was angry, bitter, and I used my wealth to hurt people rather than help them. But sometimes, if we are very lucky, life gives us a chance to change direction completely." He gestured toward Marcus, who was sitting at the other end of the table reviewing a stack of grant applications. "This young man taught me that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Today, we celebrate the first 25 grants from our foundation, representing over £2 million invested directly in the dreams and ambitions of working people right here in Manchester." The audience applauded enthusiastically. Many of them were recipients of the Foundation's first round of grants, while others were hoping to qualify for future funding. The room was filled with electricians starting their own companies, former factory workers launching catering businesses, single mothers opening daycare centers, and immigrants establishing small retail shops. David Walsh, the construction worker who had been the Foundation's very first grant recipient, stood up to address the crowd. In the 6 months since receiving his loan, he had hired 8 employees and was working on 3 major renovation projects in the Manchester area. "Before this foundation existed," David said, "I was just another unemployed factory worker with big dreams and no way to make them real. The banks wouldn't touch me, and I was starting to think I'd never get the chance to build something of my own." He looked directly at Victor and Marcus. "These gentlemen didn't just give me money. They gave me hope. They gave me the chance to prove that working-class people can be successful entrepreneurs if someone just believes in us." The applause was even louder this time, and Marcus could see tears in Victor's eyes. The Russian businessman had thrown himself into the Foundation's work with an intensity that amazed everyone who worked with him. He personally reviewed every grant application, often calling applicants to discuss their plans in detail. More importantly, Victor had developed genuine friendships with many of the grant recipients. He regularly visited their businesses, offered advice based on his own experience, and celebrated their successes as if they were his own family members. The most important thing I've learned, Victor continued when the applause died down, is that business success means nothing if it doesn't make the world a better place. Every pound we invest through this foundation comes back to us multiplied in the form of jobs created, families supported, and communities strengthened. Thompson, she said, taking his hands in hers, I need to thank you again for believing in my dream when nobody else would. Maria, you did all the hard work, Marcus replied. We just provided the initial capital. Your success is entirely due to your own skill and dedication. But you understood something that the bank loan officers didn't, Maria insisted. You understood that immigrant families work harder than anyone because we know what it's like to have nothing. When you recommended my application for approval, you changed my family's entire future. As the evening continued, Marcus reflected on how much his own life had changed since that confrontation with Victor. He was still serving as a Queen's Guard, a role he loved and took seriously, but his work with the foundation had given him a new sense of purpose. He was using his understanding of working-class communities to help channel Victor's resources toward people who really needed them. More importantly, he had discovered that he had a natural talent for recognizing viable business plans and understanding the character of the people behind them. His recommendations to the Foundation's loan committee had a nearly perfect success rate, and his ability to spot potential in unexpected places had become legendary among the Manchester business community. Captain Morrison approached Marcus as the reception was winding down. The captain had become a strong supporter of Marcus's foundation work, often adjusting duty schedules to accommodate board meetings and community events. Thompson, Morrison said with a smile, I've got some news that I think you'll find interesting. What's that, sir? I've just received word from Palace Administration. Your work with the Foundation has attracted attention at the highest levels. There's talk of recommending you for an honor in the next New Year's honors list. Marcus looked shocked. Sir, I don't understand. I haven't done anything worthy of special recognition. Haven't you? Morrison challenged. You've helped establish a foundation that has already created over 200 jobs in one of the most economically challenged areas of England. You've turned a potential international incident into a story of reconciliation and positive change. And you've done it all while maintaining exemplary service as a Queen's Guard. Victor, who had been saying goodbye to guests, overheard the conversation and approached the two men. Captain Morrison is absolutely right, Victor said. Marcus, you have no idea how many lives you've touched through this work. But there's something else I want to tell you, something I've been planning for weeks. Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out a formal envelope. I've written to your commanding officer requesting that you be considered for promotion to sergeant. Your leadership skills and judgment have impressed everyone who has worked with you, both in your military capacity and through the Foundation. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the recognition. 6 months earlier, his biggest ambition had been to serve his time as a guard with honor and distinction. Now he was being offered opportunities and honors he had never imagined possible. Victor, Captain Morrison, I appreciate this more than I can express, but I need you both to understand something, Marcus said. Everything good that has come from this situation started with a choice to respond to hatred with kindness. That's not something special about me. That's something any person can choose to do in any situation. But not everyone would make that choice, Victor pointed out, especially not in the heat of the moment, when someone has just humiliated you in front of a crowd of strangers. Maybe, Marcus conceded, but I think most people are better than they realize. They just need someone to believe in them and give them a chance to prove it. As the evening wound down, the three men walked together through the halls of the renovated mill. Victor stopped in front of a wall display that had been installed to honor the building's history. It featured photographs of workers from the mill's heyday, including several pictures of men who looked remarkably like Marcus's father. You know, Victor said quietly, I've been thinking about my father a lot lately. He died believing that I had become a man he couldn't respect. But I hope, that if he could see me now, if he could see what we're building here, he might be proud of me after all. Victor, Marcus said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder, your father would be incredibly proud of you. Not because of your success or your wealth, but because you found the courage to change when it mattered most. Natasha joined them, having finished thanking the last of the guests. She looked at her husband with unconditional love and admiration. "I have some news of my own," she said with a mysterious smile. "I've been waiting for the right moment to share this." Both men looked at her expectantly. "I'm pregnant," she announced simply. Victor's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to joy to something approaching awe. He embraced his wife gently, as if she were made of crystal. "When?" he managed to ask. "The baby will be born next spring," she said. "A new beginning for our family, just like this foundation is a new beginning for you." Marcus felt honored to witness such an intimate moment, but also deeply moved by the symbolism. The child would be born into a family that had learned the value of kindness, forgiveness, and service to others. In a very real sense, the baby would be a product of the transformation that had begun with that ugly confrontation at the palace. "I want to name the baby Victor if it's a boy," Victor said suddenly. "Victor the Third, after my father. But I want him to grow up to be the kind of man my father was, not the kind of man I became before Marcus taught me how to be better." As they prepared to leave the mill that evening, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them all to this point. One moment of choosing kindness over retaliation had created ripple effects that were still expanding, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted. The foundation was now planning to expand to other cities across England, with additional programs to help military veterans start their own businesses. There were discussions about establishing partnerships with universities to provide business education alongside the loan programs. Victor had even begun talking about creating a scholarship fund for the children of working-class families. But perhaps the most important change was in Victor himself. The angry, bitter man who had felt the need to humiliate a palace guard had become someone who found joy in lifting others up. He had learned that true power came not from dominating others, but from helping them achieve their own dreams. As they walked to their cars in the mill's parking lot, Victor turned to Marcus one last time. "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again," he said. "You saved my life that day at the palace. Not just my reputation or my freedom, but my soul. You reminded me that I could choose to be better than my anger." Marcus smiled at his friend. "Victor, you saved yourself. I just believed you could do it." The three of them stood together in the evening air, unlikely friends brought together by conflict, but united by their shared commitment to making the world a little better than they found it. Above them, the lights in the renovated mill were still glowing, illuminating the workspace where dozens of new businesses were being born from the dreams of ordinary people who had been given an extraordinary chance. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, marking not just the end of another day, but the beginning of countless new possibilities for a community that had learned to believe in itself again. The story that had begun with hatred had become a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness, and its effects would continue to spread for generations to come. Marcus Thompson had learned that sometimes the most important battles are won not with force, but with grace. And Viktor Kozlov had discovered that the greatest wealth comes not from what you accumulate, but from what you give away. Together, they had proven that it's never too late to choose a different path, and that even the ugliest moments can become the foundation for something beautiful.